What's happening, everybody? Welcome to another episode here, the Side Guys Football Forum. I'm one of your co-hosts on the side, joined as always by my good friend, my good buddy, the other half of the Side Guys, Mr. Tad the Side. And Tad, I'm pretty sure you may get asked this question quite a bit when you tell people like, oh, I have a podcast. Like, what is your podcast about? And you may say that it was about fantasy football, and during the offseason, we do the NFL draft. And I'm pretty sure you may get out of those handful of people that ask you, like, what is fantasy football? Like, I mean, am I sort of down the right path here as far as like people that you encounter?
Almost is. I do it a little different way. Is they're like, oh, you have a podcast about what? I'm like, football, and they go, oh.
Okay, there you go. So you lost even just that football.
To be fair, it's a pretty oversaturated market. And then I go, but fantasy football, they go, ooh.
Okay, so you got some people that are actually interested.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
Finding that angle for us.
Sounds good. I like it. So yeah, I think just, standard for me is that when I tell people that I also host a podcast is that when they ask about fantasy football, they're like, oh, that's nice. But clearly you can see that they're not lost all interest in whatever my podcast is about. Right. And so that's actually the purpose of our next couple of episodes is that we're going to be doing a sort of dive into fantasy football and sort of get those people that, this has sort of become an all around craze. I mean, before it used to be started, like very few people used to play fantasy football, but now it's become this mass market thing. I mean, they even ask NFL players like about the leagues that they play in and stuff like that. So, I mean, like, yeah, this has become quite a phenomenon across the country, even internationally as well. So, I mean, yeah, we're going to be going into like, what is fantasy football and sort of, get some of those people that are interested in playing, because I'm pretty sure, going into work, I'm pretty sure there's somebody out there that's asking like, oh, hey, I'm starting fantasy football league. Are you interested? You're probably like, well, I don't know much about it. Well, that's what the next couple of episodes are here for. We're here to give you sort of the 101 as we're titling this series, a fantasy 101 about all that. And hey, it actually works in favor, Tad, because, back to school is happening as well. So it's sort of like,
fortunately,
it all ties in together. It works really nicely. And, maybe, you may not be familiar with fantasy football, but you could be familiar with betting. And that's where our sponsors at Underdog Fantasy come into play here. Because, I mean, yeah, you can make anywhere bets across the NFL. You can bet on the Olympics that's happening right now. We have the USA basketball team, both the men's and the women's. They're cruising now in the tournament stage. They've always been cruising in the group stage. So you can bet on their success in the tournament stage. You can bet on, gymnastics, whatever Olympic sport that you want to bet on. The MLB season is coming close to wrapping up their regular season. So you can bet on all those games. The NFL season is right around the corner. The NCAA football season is right around the corner. So whatever you're comfortable betting in, all you have to do is make anywhere between 2 and 8 different prop bet picks across whatever sports you're comfortable with. More picks you make, the more potential money you can win. And guys, Underdog Fantasy wants to get you in the action. They shared a promo code with us. We're going to share that with you. That promo code is DESAI. DESAI. You could double up on your initial deposit of $10 or more, up to $500, courtesy of our good friends at Underdog Fantasy. So, I mean, hypothetically, if you were to put in that max amount, $500 on your first deposit, use our promo code DESAI, DESAI. You can get that match dollar for dollar, and you can bet with up to $1,000 on their betting platform. You can use the website, very easy to use website. You can use the mobile device apps, either on Android or Apple devices. It's very user-friendly, very easy to use. And guys, get in the action. 10 things you can be betting on. You can make some money as the sort of waiting months of summer roll around, right as we get closer to those holiday months, and get some good scratch as we get closer to those months as well. So that promo code, once again, is DESAI, DESAI. Double up on your initial deposit of $10 or more, up to $500, courtesy of our good friends at Underdog Fantasy. So, Ted, like we sort of teased at the very beginning here, we're doing a fantasy football 101 series, getting into the very beginnings of just like, what is fantasy football? How does it work? How do you get into a league? What platforms can you play on? Just all of that. But before we get into all that, Ted, I want to ask you, we sort of discussed this before, but just how did you get into fantasy football?
I don't exactly remember what my first year was. I think it was, I'm trying to remember if I did it in high school. I think I started fantasy football. And this sounds so weird with this phrasing. I think I started in fantasy football late in my high school career when I was a junior or senior, because that's when it really became easier to do it online, which is
Yeah.
crazy to think. And there's a great 30 for 30. I don't know if you ever saw it on the history of fantasy football. And really, it just started out with a bunch of guys. I think this is why it has become so popular now. A bunch of guys be like, we love football, but we don't really want to put money on it. Let's get invested in it some other way. That was pretty much it with me and my high school friends. And then, I tried to organize some leagues in college, and no one really caught on. I was way more passionate about it than anyone else. And I was just like, why does no one else care this much? And then a group of friends that I, made in college invited me into their league. That was, wow, I almost have 4 years ago, but that was closer to like 6 or 7 now. We're getting old, man. But yes, that league takes it very intensely. Of course, we had a 4-hour long debate on when our draft should be just the other day. So no, I think the beauty of fantasy football is if your team sucks, if you're like a Cleveland Browns fan, if you're a Las Vegas Raiders fan, and you just know this is gonna be a long ass season, you can still derive some joy from it. And the best type of joy is being able to gloat over your friends for an entire summer. See, it's so exciting. Even Cap's like, I need to get in on this.
Cap needs to learn about this stuff. Yeah,
exactly. He's very young. He actually just turned 5. So happy birthday, Cap. But I think that's the real joy of fantasy football is even if, your team that you cheer for sucks, it gives you yet another rooting interest in the NFL. And, once you're in, you're in. It's hard to let go. It is a near addiction.
Near addiction is a very accurate description for sure. So yeah, my sort of foray into fantasy football became right around 8th grade, 9th grade. That's when I first started. I remember the first platform that I played on was on Yahoo. I think I explained this in our last episode. We had very large rosters because there's only 6 of us in a league. And so, yeah, there's a very large rosters. We played with defensive players as well as the offensive players. And yeah, ever since then, I've been playing every single year. I still play with some of those folks. Some of those folks have moved on to stop playing fantasy football. Like you said, the interest sort of waned. But yeah, this has been a big part of my life for probably half my, life on this earth. So it's like a big thing for me. But yeah, Ted, let's sort of get into fantasy football. Like, I mean, what is it? I mean, it's very simple. It's just pretty much you get points based on the actions performed by players on the field. So, I mean, yeah, if a player scores a touchdown, you get a point equivalent in your fantasy football league. And then obviously you play against other people in this league. And then whoever has the most points in a given week, they get a win for that particular week. And then the more wins you make, then you can make the playoffs. And once you make the playoffs, you could obviously win your entire fantasy football league. So, I mean, it's as simple as that. I mean, Tad, am I missing anything as far as like just the basics as far as what is fantasy football?
I think like let's hit some of the key terminology while we're at it. Is like I think because people hear that and they're just like, so just take the best players, and we'll get into that. And
there's a lot more we're gonna get into. For sure.
And obviously that is a big part of it. But that's also where like kind of what I was touching on, where the gloating with friends comes in, because there are these things called sleepers, where it's a player that no one thinks is going to do all that well and is going to blow up. In fact, I remember I've seen rumors. I know we're getting a little into the weeds here that Juju Smith-Schuster may actually be part of the Brandon Ayuk trade to the New England Patriots.
That would be interesting.
Smith-Schuster would shoot up my sleeper list then. I think he would be a very interesting receiver to keep your eye on. But that's the kind of thing is I would be willing to bet if I text my friends right now, some of them had not heard about this potential trade that's about to go down. And that's kind of the fun of college football. Well, it's the fun of college football.
You can do fantasy college football too, for sure.
Yes, that's true. That's much tougher though. But that's the fun of fantasy football is, it's where can you find the value where nothing else is. And the other nice thing too is, this happened a couple years ago. And by that, I think I mean last year, where there was a rookie running back that everyone thought was going to kill it. I was saying he wasn't going to be that good. Eventually, he wasn't that good. So, again, I think that's where, if you explain fantasy football in the most simple terms, it sounds very simple, but there's just so much strategy on top of it. But that's what, podcasts like ours are here for, is to help break it down. But that's also the fun thing. That's how it becomes a near addiction is, it becomes like so much research is involved. But at the same time, it's not research that like the simpleton can't do. I'm terrible at math. I have proven that time and time again. but I am, or I like to think I'm fairly good at, fantasy football. So it's one of those things that, it's daunting, but once you actually get involved, you're like, oh, this actually isn't that bad.
I agree with that for sure. And we'll get into for sure like strategies and all of that stuff, a little bit later in today's episode and definitely in the next episode. But let's sort of start with some more of those basics again here, Tad. So, I mean, we kind of went over what exactly is fantasy football. Is just pretty much, equivalent actions of what happens on the field correlate to points that happen with your team that you, eventually select. And then that's how you get points. And then based on that, the more points you have in a given week, that's how you get up wins and things along those lines. So, how many people are in a fantasy football league? Well, like I said, I mean, you could play with as many people as you want. Like I said, when I first started fantasy football, I had, very similar to your experience, I didn't have a lot of people that were interested in it. So it was like me and just like my core group of friends, and there's only 6 of us. But I mean, yeah, in today's day and age, because of the popularity of it, like, I mean, Tad, I've seen leagues where it's like they have 32 different people in a given league. It's crazy that just like everybody just has that many teams in a league. But I would
32-person league, seek help.
But I think that speaks to like the variety of the different types of leagues out there, which we'll get to a little bit later in this episode. But it's just like, yeah, it's really dependent on however many people you can have interested in your league, what type of league that you want to be playing in. But I'd probably say the average number of people that I see in a fantasy football league would probably be anywhere between 10 and 12 people. That's usually around the sweet spot. Tad, I think you play in a 10-person league. I usually try and average about 12 people in my league. But I see those are pretty much the standards. I mean, if you're familiar with a very popular comedy show that is unfortunately ended in series, but a few handful of years ago, it's called The League. They play in an 8-person league, and they've ran that league for 6 seasons. I can't remember if I remember correctly, or it might have been 7 seasons.
Yeah, correctly. 6 to 8, something like that.
Yeah, something like that. So, but yeah, I think it's just however many people that you can get interested in a football league. But I'd probably say that sweet spot is somewhere around 10 to 12 different players in your respective league. So
I would say, obviously I'm biased because like you said, yes, my main league is 10 people. That's a sweet spot. And in case, the listeners, viewer is wondering like, what does it matter? Is essentially that the more people you have, the more thin your roster is. And by that, I mean, the harder it is to find good players. I'm sure we're going to touch on this later, but there's a thing called the waiver wire, and we'll touch on that in a bit. Yes. Actually, we'll touch on that next episode, I'm sure. But that is a critical piece of fantasy football and becomes much more difficult with the more people you have in the league. That's why I like 10, because it's still a challenge. It's basically, think about it when you're playing a video game and you don't quite play on like rookie difficulty. Oh, so now you go out on rookie difficulty, huh? But you also don't play on like the hardest difficulty either. It's like that perfect in between. And so that's the big difference, is like just how difficult it is. And like you said, you actually stole my reference because I was geared up for that. Is that's my favorite part of the league, is like the smaller the league, quote unquote, the easier it is. So as all these characters in the league meet all these NFL players, they're like, oh, you're in a league? And they're like, yeah, it's an 8-man league. And they're like, oh.
Yeah.
It's because supposedly the smaller it is, the easier it is. And I will say I did one time do an 8-man league. And actually, I think we did that league together. Wasn't that our first LAFB league, 8-man?
No, I think we've always been around 10 or 12 with the LAFB league, for sure.
Don't quite remember the context behind when I think that might have been work league where it was 8-man. And it's still fun if you want to, kind of dip your toe in it. I think that might be a good way to do it, just because the teams are just so stacked that, it's like playing a video game on rookie difficulty where your final football game is like 80-10. But that is the real, kind of that's really where the difference is when it comes to league size.
Yeah, I think that plays a huge factor for sure. And we'll cover that for sure as we get into like roster settings and league settings and all that stuff, as far as how that affects your strategy when it comes to building out your roster for sure. So yeah, I think anywhere around 10 to 12 is usually like a good average for fantasy leagues that I've always encountered. But yeah, honestly, like, I mean, if you're just trying to get into it and you're playing with a bunch of people who have no idea what's going on, then yeah, you could play in like a 4 or 6-person league. There's really no limit to the amount of people that you can have as far as a minimum, but there's usually no limit as far as the maximum either. It really just depends on how many people want to play with you. That's the biggest thing. Now, next question is, where do you play fantasy football? So, I mean, that's the big thing as far as just like, how can you get active? Where can you sort of find open leagues is usually a very common thing too. Like maybe you don't have a lot of people that are interested in playing, but with the mass popularity around fantasy football, you could sort of just go onto some of these league platforms and just be like, okay, I want to join this open league and just play with a bunch of randos off the internet across wherever they are. Who knows where they are, sort of thing. So that's another way you can sort of get into it. So, I mean, you got your popular websites, you got your ESPN, Yahoo does fantasy football. You can play on NFL.com if you're on their website all the time. Most of the major, network platforms have something. So like CBS and ABC and NBC, they have their various forms of fantasy football platforms. But you could also get into the more like in-tuned fantasy platform apps that sort of cater to the everyday fantasy player that sort of have certain needs when it comes to the platform that they're looking for. Like they want up-to-date information and they want updated, player trades and all that stuff that happen a little bit faster compared to a, mass market site like a Yahoo or a, NFL.com that may not happen as quicker as maybe you'd like. So there's websites and apps out there like Sleeper. There's My Fantasy League. I mean, there's a bunch of other platforms out there. And believe me, because it's such a popular, what I call it a sport, I'd probably say a hobby. Fantasy football is a hobby.
Yeah, it's not a sport. It's not a sport
for sure. But just with the popularity of it, there's a bunch of emerging platforms that's like, oh, we do this better. We do this better. So, I mean, find what caters to your needs the best. I'd probably say with my experience, I found the most user friendliness as well as just the overall, like even for the experienced players, just the overall best experience with Sleeper. But I mean, like I said, I started on Yahoo. I still play in a couple Yahoo leagues from some of my friends. They run on Yahoo. Tad, I think you host your league on ESPN. I remember I used to do all my leagues on ESPN as well. So, I mean, just, yeah, it's whatever you find the most comfortable. That's probably the platform that you want to go to. But I think my go-to would probably be the Sleeper platform.
My go-to has always been ESPN, but it's funny, and this might be kind of a weird comparison, but I kind of compare it to like that first time you get like a kind of happy drunk off an alcohol, and for basically the rest of your adult life, you're hooked on, not hooked, that's the wrong word, but like that is your preferred type of alcohol. Like for me, it was gin. The first time I got drunk, and it was truly like, oh, this is nice. And ever since then, I prefer gin. And it's kind of the same thing with fantasy football is like, I can almost promise you whatever league you start on will be your preferred league. You can't really go wrong with any of them. They are very different just in terms of, interface of how they move, how you adjust rosters, how the waiver wire looks. The general functionality of them remains largely the same. Because the functionality kind of bends on league by league, but again, we'll get into that later. So really, I will say this, of like whatever you pick will probably end up being your preferred one, because I started off with ESPN, and hence why I was actually the like leader of switching my league, because my league when I joined actually was on NFL.com. I didn't really have a problem with it. I just liked ESPN better because I was more used to it. So it's just whatever you're more used to. So I would say that's the biggest piece of advice of like, where do I play? Doesn't really matter. Most of these sites are really good. There are only a couple where I really don't think you should play on, but I'm not going to say it because I don't want to ruin any future sponsorship opportunities.
Sure.
But I will say that, I think whatever you end up picking, you'll be happy with, and that's likely what you will stick with for not the rest of your playing days, but a large portion of it.
Yeah, I think once you eventually get the hang of it and you sort of get addicted to fantasy football, you may try other platforms to be like, okay, I think I like this one better compared to this, and I may like this compared to this. I don't like this compared to this. But yeah, when you're starting out, I think I completely agree with Tad. It's just like, jump on whatever, people are interested in if they have a preference, and then you can sort of, it's just the standard as any other website or app that you use. There's things that you're going to like, and there's things that you're not going to like. Even if you've never played fantasy football before, you're just going to be like, oh, well, this is showing me more information that I, am very happy about. But then it's like, maybe they'll, maybe trying to click it is not as smooth as like, maybe something else, so just like that comes with just user experience with any website or any app that you use. So you may find things that's just like, oh, I wish this was better. And then maybe the next year you'll try something else and be like, oh, they fixed this. Oh, but then they're not giving me this. And so it's like, you'll run your try and error. But yeah, I do agree with Ted that sometimes you tend to sort of jump on something. You may stick with that for most of your life. But I mean, yeah, if you're out there and you get addicted and you try out different platforms, then you'll find what you're looking for. And I'm pretty sure with all the platforms out there, you'll be able to find exactly what sort of makes you the happiest when you're playing and being able to adjust things the best that you want to. So, all right, Dad. So let's see. We got here, we explained fantasy football, we explained different types of leagues out there as far as the platforms are out there. And so now you're in a fantasy football league. What are the next steps now? Like, I mean, the biggest thing here that I'd probably say is understand your league and understand your scoring settings. So the first thing that you do as soon as you join a fantasy league, doesn't matter the platform, doesn't matter who you're playing with, look at the scoring settings and look at the league settings. Tad brought this point up when we were discussing the number of people in your league. It makes a huge difference when you're looking at a league with 10 people in your league versus 12 people. It's just like Tad said, when you're eventually going to get to your fantasy football draft, where you select all the players for your eventual team, the people that don't get drafted get dropped into what's called a waiver pool. And that's where you add players week to week when, players get hurt or, players are on a bye week when the team doesn't have any games going on. So that's where you have to make adjustments to your roster. And so when you're in a 12-person league, that waiver wire pool has maybe not as many talented players in there compared to when you're playing in a 10-person league. There's a lot more potential diamonds in the rough that you can find in that waiver wire pool, So you want to check as far as how many people are in your league. Then you want to look at things like scoring. So this is a big thing. So pretty much the standard of what most leagues now are PPR. And Tad, explain to the good folks what PPR is.
So PPR stands for points per reception. And so that applies to, and again, that's why you need to check your league settings, because sometimes it applies to both receivers and tight ends. I've also seen leagues where it solely applies to wide receivers. So there's PPR and half PPR. And it's actually funny you say PPR is did you mean half PPR? Because I'm pretty sure that's the most popular one.
No, I just meant PPR is the standard. Now, whether you half point or maybe make a full point, that is different, yes.
So, and I'll get into, if you're like, what the fuck are these two talking about? I'm about to get into it, don't worry. So PPR, again, stands for points per reception, which means if a receiver does not score a touchdown, which normally gets you 6 points, they can still get you a lot of points through how many catches they get. So a full PPR league, and one of my favorite sports podcasts, other than this one, had a great joke where they would take in fantasy football callers, and even if it was not related to wide receiver at all, they'd be like, yeah, Aaron Rodgers against, well, I mean, it shows how dated this joke is, but they were like, oh, Aaron Rodgers against the Jets. How's he going to do? And the joke was always half PPR or full PPR, even though it didn't matter for a quarterback. So what that means is full PPR means for every catch, the receiver gets 1 extra point. I see this as the least popular option of the two, because I think a lot of people realize that's pretty stacked. A point is a big deal. I would say, and it's funny because I noticed this is a disagreement with me and my friends. I would say 12 points is a pretty solid week from your receiver. Would you agree with that?
That's about average. I can see that.
So that means, but that's fairly easy for a receiver to get in full PPR leagues, because that means 4 catches for 80 yards, no touchdowns, they're at 12 points. That's pretty stacked. That's a pretty pedestrian, stat line. Half PPR means you get half a point per catch. So that kind of evens the odds a little bit where, yeah, you can draft a receiver who gets a bunch of catches, Wes Welker type, a slot type of receiver who will rack up the catches, but maybe not get as many touchdowns. And there's a little bit of strategy there with the trade-off. So that's what's really interesting with PPR and half PPR. And again, you really need to look at the settings. We cannot emphasize that enough because, this is I won't say argument, but this is a debate my league had a few years ago where traditionally in most leagues, a quarterback throwing so if a receiver or running back scores a touchdown, it's usually traditionally 6 points for your team because
Cat needs to know the scoring setting.
He's very invested right now.
Oh, yeah.
It's also bedtime, so he's very ready for that. But so if a quarterback or receiver scores, traditionally it's 6 points because those are more rare for that player. Where if a quarterback throws for a touchdown, it's usually 4 points. Now, someone in my league proposed, why don't we do 6 points for a quarterback throwing touchdown? I should say all because there was a little bit of a debate, but we largely vetoed that because that largely affects the quarterback's draft value. That makes the quarterback, who is already a very valuable position, even that much more valuable. So it's stuff like that why you need to look at your scoring settings. And I'm glad you brought this up before, where you can join random leagues. I've done it before, where it's like I just get bored in August. And I'm like, screw it, I'll just join a random league that I never look at again. And that's perfectly fine. The only problem is, largely if you do that, most of these sites, Yahoo, ESPN, they will randomize the settings. So you need to look at that before you join. And if you want to dip your toe in with a bunch of strangers, like, oh, I don't want to be embarrassed in front of my friends, I say go for it. It's a lot of fun. There's very little, invested emotionally. So you're just kind of like, let me get used to it. But again, it's super important that you look, am I full PPR, half PPR? Or am I no PPR? That is still an option. It's like you said, it's slowly going down in popularity, but it's still out there. How much is a touchdown? How much some leagues have? If the catch goes for further than 10 yards, it's more points. If it goes further than 20 yards, it's extra points there. I personally don't like that, but there are leagues that do that. So that's the most important thing when getting started once you join your league, is definitely familiarize yourself with how those rules work.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. And you're probably wondering, like, when Tad put out that number of like, 4 catches for 80 yards and no touchdowns, that's going to equal 12 points. Well, that's based on just your standard scoring metric. So it's 4 points because he got 4 catches in a full PPR league. So that's 1 point per reception or per catch. And then 80 yards because you get 1 point for every 10 yards of receiving that a receiver gets. So that's why you get the 8 points, and the 8 plus the 4, you get the 12. You didn't score a touchdown, so you don't get the bonus points there. So that's very standard league scoring settings, but it's like you need to make sure you're checking your scoring settings, because maybe you play in a league where they want very high scoring matchups. So it's like maybe every 5 yards you get a point, or it's like instead of, getting every 10 yards, they want the points a lot lower. So it's like instead of every 10 yards, it's every 15 yards you get a point. And so it's like those are the things that sort of make a difference. And then also, some leagues don't add the fractional point. So it's like in this case, let's say, you have a receiver that had 4 catches for 81 yards. In a standard scoring setting, you get the 4 points for the 4 catches. Then you get the 81 yards. So that's 8 points for 1 for every 10 yards. But then you get a fractional 0.1 points because he got that 1 extra yard. He didn't get to 90, but he did get to 81. So you get that 0.1. Some leagues don't give you that fractional point. So if you got 81 yards, you will stick with 80 points. It doesn't round up. So then you get 9 points for having 90 possible receiving yards. So it's like you have to check on those things. Like Tad said, some leagues like to have the bonus settings where it's like if a receiver goes for over 100 receiving yards, you get bonus points for that. If a quarterback goes for over 300 passing yards, you get a bonus point for that. If they have a 50-yard touchdown, regardless of the player, that's like there's bonus points for that. So, I mean, those are things that you need to be aware of, because that all goes into your draft strategy as far as when you're ready to draft your team, which we'll get to a little bit later in next week's episode, as well as a little bit towards the end of this episode. But the also thing that's important, Tad, pay attention to your roster settings too, because some leagues, they play with only 1 quarterback. I know some of the sort of the new, like trending thing in fantasy football's league is that they play in super flex leagues or 2 quarterback leagues. So, I mean, in case you don't know what a flex is, a flex means that you can start any position that is not the quarterback position. So you can start a running back, you can start a wide receiver, or you can start a tight end at the flex position.
Don't do tight ends. That's the best
advice. It really just depends on the strategy.
Don't do no.
It depends on the strategy.
No, it does not depend on strategy.
We'll get into that a little bit later. We're getting to strategy a little bit later here, but just as far as roster settings, so that's what it is. But if you play in a super flex league, not only can you start a running back, a receiver, or a tight end, but now you can start a quarterback in that flex position because it's a super flex, and that changes your strategy then as far as like, okay, now I need to start thinking about getting multiple good quarterbacks for my roster in order to compete week in and week out. Big things that also change as far as like the number of bench players that you have. So
actually, sorry to interrupt, but that was probably the biggest debate my main league has ever had. Is we shrunk the bench and we added an IR spot. So for those of you who don't know, an IR spot stands for injured reserve. So if your player, and now normally in traditional, well, I guess they were kind of playing around with this rule in the NFL as well, but traditionally players put on IR, he's done for the season. Well, why would I want to keep him around? IR in fantasy football is a little different. If a player's out for, let's say, 8 weeks, you can put him on the IR spot. It opens up a bench spot, so you get to keep that player, but you put him on the IR spot, and when he comes back, you got to drop someone eventually. But it's basically like kind of dibs, like this guy got hurt, he's coming back. And that was, honest to God, probably the biggest debate we ever had is we shrunk our bench from 5 to 4. And you would think like, oh, what's the big deal? But because that was kind of my thing. I was like, why are we debating so hard about this? And then that first season with a shrunk bench, that was way tougher than I thought it would be. So like bench size, I'm glad you brought that up. That is a very key part of this game because in an ideal world, you want to back up for every position. But when you shrink it, you got to prioritize certain positions over others. And it gets very, very tough.
Yeah, those of you who may be wondering, what is a bench? Well, when you're going into your starting lineup every single week, is like you have your starting players. So you have your, set number of positions that start. So it's usually typically in a standard league, you get one quarterback, two running backs, two receivers, a tight end, a flex, a kicker, and a defense. So it's usually around 8 different players that you're starting. So these are the players that are going to get you points in a given week. So that's usually what it is. Now, the rest of your roster is built out through a bench. So these are guys that you can draft. So then it's like, depending on the matchup. So let's say, San Francisco is playing the Carolina Panthers and you have Christian McCaffrey on your roster who plays for the San Francisco 49ers. It's like, okay, I want to start Christian McCaffrey as opposed to Saquon Barkley with the Philadelphia Eagles playing against the New York Jets defense. Jets have a pretty strong run defense. So it's like, okay, in this case, I'd prefer to start Christian McCaffrey over Saquon Barkley. So Saquon Barkley is going to stay on my bench. He's still on my team, but he's not going to start for me this week. But like I said, this is where having a bench sort of plays into your favor, is that when Christian McCaffrey and the San Francisco 49ers get to their bye week, they're not even going to have a game. But let's say the Philadelphia Eagles don't have their bye week the same week. Now you don't have to worry about going to the waiver wire to grab a player. You just take Saquon Barkley from your bench, put him in your starting lineup, and now he will score points for you in that given week. So that's the difference between bench and your starting players. And so, yeah, as mentioned with your roster settings, some people may expand your starting lineup. So it's like maybe they'll add an extra flex spot. Maybe they'll make it an extra wide receiver. Maybe they won't even have set positions and it's just a quarterback and a bunch of flex positions. That's something that's like very fluid as far as what you want to do. So this is where it pays very much important that you check your roster settings, because that's how you then figure out your draft strategy when it comes to your fantasy football draft. So, I mean, that's very critical stuff. Like Tad said, the number of bench spots plays a key factor too. So it's like, if you have a guy that may get injured a lot, it's good to have a backup for him. That's like, okay, in case this guy gets hurt, I just swap in this guy and I'm good to go. I don't have to worry about going to the waiver wire. So, that's why it's important to check out your roster settings. But the also thing that's important to check with both your roster and your scoring settings is because there's a ton of leagues out there, Tad. I mean, like, we've kind of gone over this in a past episode, but here's a good chance to sort of go over the different types of leagues. So if you're new to fantasy football, the best thing that I'll recommend is do a redraft league. So that's just your standard fantasy football league. Pretty much the team that you draft this year will all reset. And then if you decide to play again next year, you redraft a new team. Hence why it's called a redraft league. Other leagues that are out there, if you really get addicted to it, there's something called Dynasty. Good friend of the podcast, Jason Davis. He plays in a Dynasty league and he asks us for advice all the time. But pretty much what Dynasty means is that you draft a roster and that is your roster forever, essentially. So it's like the only thing you change your roster through is through very much similar to the NFL that you watch. It's like you make trades, you get the rookie draft that comes in, you can add players off the waiver wire like your standard redraft league as well. But it's like overall, it's like, if you draft, like I said, Christian McCaffrey, if he is on your roster, he is on your roster next year, the year after, until he retires. He is on your roster until you decide to trade him or, you don't want him on your roster anymore. But then the fun thing with Dynasty leagues is that not only can you trade players, but because you run it like a dynasty, you could trade draft picks as well. So it's like, okay, maybe your team's not going to be doing all that good this year. Now you could start trading for draft picks. So then you get more rookies next year in the rookie draft after the NFL draft happens. And that's how you build your roster that way. So that's the fun of Dynasty League. And some people like the sort of control that's like, okay, this is my roster. I could tweak it a little bit, but it's like, I like having this year over year over year. So, well, like I said, avoid that. If you're a newbie, go with the redraft. That's the first thing.
And let's clarify one thing, because if you're like a football fan and you're just like, wait, what do you mean you can only do that in Dynasty leagues? There are some redraft leagues where you can trade up, but that is largely like more done in person rather than like actually. It's kind of like the NBA where they're like, hey, I'll trade you this guy after the draft, and you got put on the, it's Kobe Bryant with the Charlotte Hornets hat. Exactly. It's kind of like that in redraft leagues. So normally I would say probably like 80-90% of redraft leagues, no, you cannot trade in the draft. And we will touch on that in a later episode of, just how draft, order is determined. The fun short answers, it's up to you, which is also very dangerous.
We'll get to that in this episode, actually. We'll get to the actual draft stuff in the next episode.
But largely, yes, no, there is no trading in redraft leagues when it comes to the draft. And what redraft leagues essentially means is you get to keep your team name, you get to keep everything else, but your roster at the end of the year is wiped clean. Usually they wipe it clean shortly after the Super Bowl, and you just start anew every single year. And there's actually a debate. My league is currently we are involved in a lot of debates. I should never have been commissioner, but is some of us want to try a dynasty league because yes, redraft is a lot of fun, but at the same time, dynasty you also kind of grow, and this is going to sound dramatic, but you grow that kind of like emotional bond to your team as well. And there's a lot of it involves a lot more strategy because if you have a team, and exactly like, I'm so glad you laid it out, it's pretty much like you're actually running your own team, because if your team's starting to age up, if you have God, who's getting old now, if you have Aaron Rodgers as your quarterback right now, trading him might not be the worst idea, because he is primed for a pretty good season, and you might want to bail on that, like you sell him at his highest point. So it definitely involves a lot more attention. It definitely involves a lot more detail, but I think dynasty drafts are more, dynasty leagues are more fun, while redraft leagues are probably the best way to get started. Because like I said, I've been playing fantasy football for almost 11, 12 years now, and only just now is my interest in dynasty league kind of peaking. And it will take a while, so I do not recommend starting off dynasty. Go for it.
Definitely not.
But I think redraft's definitely the way to go.
Redraft's definitely the go. Also, another option that's good for people who have never played fantasy football. This is a very, actually courtesy of our good friends at Underdog Fantasy. They run this platform on their website as well. It's called Best Ball. And so if you're not familiar with, you can bet with Underdog Fantasy, but you can also play fantasy football with Underdog Fantasy as well.
It's betting as well.
No, it's true. Like I said, so the good thing about Best Ball is that literally you draft a roster, and that is it. You do not adjust your roster in any way. There's no trades. There's no worrying about waiver wire. There's no willing about, I remember how explaining about your starting roster or bench. You don't have to worry about that either. What Underdog Fantasy does for you is it takes the roster that you've drafted, and each and every week, it will start for you the best roster as far as the most maximum points you can get in a given week. And so it's nice for people who have never played fantasy football. It's a good way to get your toe dipped into the water here as far as just like, okay, this is sort of what it's like. But it's like, it's nice that you don't have to worry about each and every week, because we'll get into this later as well. But just like some of the, things that people tend to forget is like, you have to set your roster each and every week. So it's like with the sort of changes of like Thursday night games and Monday night games and bye weeks, and, they're wanting to do Black Friday games last year, right, like all this stuff. It's like,
was that this year or last year? We had a Wednesday game for Christmas.
I think it was last year. I think this year we have a Tuesday game, if I remember correctly. But just like any given day of the week now, there's a potential football game. So it's like you have to make sure you set your lineup before that specific date. So we'll get to all that after we do our draft talk, obviously. But just like, if you want to avoid all that headache, do a best ball league, because literally you just draft your roster, you set it, and you forget it. You don't have to worry about anything ever again with the best ball league. So I'd recommend best ball or redraft if you're first time playing fantasy football. Those are your best options for you. Some other fun leagues out there, I don't recommend these for newbies either. Actually, the next one I may recommend, DFS. So in case you don't know what DFS is, that's daily fantasy sports. So
honestly, that's a great way to get kind of dip your toe in the water, actually.
Yeah, so that's a good one as well, because you don't have the commitment of having to play for a full season. It's the nice thing about daily fantasy sports is it's literally in the name, daily. So it's like you just do, I guess in this case it's weekly, but right. But depending on the sports, daily. Like if you're playing in the MLB daily fantasy sports at NBA, then it could possibly be daily. But the nice thing about daily fantasy sports is that you draft a roster just for that week. So it's like when the week 1 of the NFL season happens and you play on a daily fantasy site platform. So some of the common platforms you see out there, there's FanDuel and DraftKings and a few others out there, but those would be the two biggest ones. Pretty much what you do is the same thing that you would do with, a normal fantasy football league. But this is the nice thing that's different, is that you only draft for that 1 week. And so it's like whatever points you accumulate for that week and you beat your opponent or you beat your list of opponents, if you're playing in a tournament or like a league style setting, then that's it. Then your roster's wiped clean, and then you can do it again the next week and you draft a whole new roster. But the weird thing is that multiple people can have multiple different players, because what happens is that your roster is based off of a salary amount. So you're given $50,000 to spend on players, and different players have higher value attributed to them. So Christian McCaffrey, I think I've seen like $10,000 for him to play in your roster. So you pay for him, then you add a bunch of other options, and you have to be within that $50,000 limit. Otherwise, you can't submit a lineup. And so it's like nice strategy where it's like you want to pick all the good players, but they're probably going to be a lot more expensive. So you can't stock your roster with a bunch of very expensive players. You have to go with some of the cheaper options that could have a good week. And that's where it sort of plays into the strategy of like, okay, who has a better matchup? Like this team is playing this team. This team has a bad defense. I want to exploit that matchup. So that's sort of where you get some beneficiaries as far as some good matchups, get some cheaper options out there. So that's an option for people to entertain as well. Tad, before I sort of let you jump in here, just a couple of leagues that I want to bring up here. Vampire League. This was kind of all the craze maybe like about 2 years ago. Tad, I know you played in the Vampire League last year.
I was so disappointed. I was so excited for that Vampire League because I will fully admit, in case listeners who can't see me are like, did he just drop from the episode? No, it's just that look, I am a very proud individual, but you have way more experience in this area of fantasy football. I have not ventured into these weird ass leagues like you have, and I finally got involved in a Vampire League, and no one did it. And I was so excited because Vampire League sound awesome. So I'm still waiting for my first true Vampire League experience.
Maybe we'll find one and we'll do it. But yeah, for those of you who are interested, I don't recommend this for newbies. This is very much a more experienced thing for more experienced fantasy football players. But the whole purpose of this is that depending on the number of members in your league, let's say there's 12, 11 of the members of your league draft a roster. So they go through the standard settings of they draft a roster, they draft everything. But then what happens with that 12th person is they're called the Vampire, or in some leagues, they also call them zombie leagues. Either way that you want to call it, they sort of interchange that way.
Vampire is offensive now.
The most common one that I've always heard is the Vampire League. So what happens with that Vampire League, vampire person in this league is that they get to build their roster through that waiver wire pool that we were explaining. So all the players that don't get drafted, the Vampire gets to build a roster with that pool of players. And then what happens is that when the fantasy season begins, if the Vampire beats any of the other league members, what they get to do is they get to steal a player from the starting roster or from the team overall. Settings depend based on who's running the Vampire League, but they get to steal a player from that opposing roster and they get infected. And so they get to join the Vampire Squad's new team. And overall, what the advantages that the Vampire has then is that they're the ones that get first priority on the waiver wire. So it's like after a week, they're the ones that can select their players first from the waiver wire compared to everybody else. They're one of the few teams that, can make their roster stronger throughout the season. The other 11 people, they can't make trades. They can't adjust the waiver wire as much, once again, depending on the league settings. But the overall sort of benefit of being the Vampire is that if you beat a team, you could steal some of their best players, and then that's how your team becomes a lot better. So like I said, very advanced stuff. I'm only going through the basics of it because there's a lot more I can go into detail with the Vampire League, but I'll stop it there. The last league that I want to bring up that's actually kind of fun too is an Eliminator or a Guillotine League. So if you're not familiar with this, the standard as a redraft league, you draft your league, everything happens the same way. But what happens is that your goal is to survive each and every week. So if you end up with the lowest total among all members of your league in a given week, you are cut and you are done. You do not play fantasy football in that league for the rest of the year. You have to worry about playing fantasy football with other leagues that you're in or whatever. So that's the whole goal. That's why it's called an Eliminator or a Guillotine League, because the last person who finishes in dead last amongst everybody, they get eliminated and everybody else continues playing. And pretty much you want to be the last person standing in that league. So a little bit of fun there. You're pretty much just avoiding being last, but then once you get towards the end, you definitely want to be the best player available there. So with that, I mean, scoring settings work differently, where it's like the guillotine, once that guillotine team gets eliminated, all their players go in the waiver wire pool, so that could get picked from. It's if they get eliminated, that's it. All those players are out of bounds, sort of thing, like you can't draft from them. So it's different settings once again for that too, but that is another league that sort of grown in popularity as well. But just like I said, we said this at the very top here, but just like regardless of what league you're in, we can't stress this enough. Look at your roster settings and look at your scoring settings, because that is how you attack your draft strategy. And I think that's the next step, Tad, as far as how we get into fantasy football, because that's the next thing that you're waiting for. Now you're in a league, you figured out what your scoring settings are, you figured out what your roster settings are. What's the next thing to do? Figure out the fantasy draft. And so usually whoever the committer, well, not usually, whoever is the fantasy commissioner, they will figure out what's the draft date. And so in my league, I think in the LAFB league, I'm also the commissioner. I'm also the commissioner of my own league.
What do you mean you think?
Well, you sort of are a co-commissioner, but I pretty
No,
much
I'm
run
not.
everything. So it's like,
No,
yeah,
okay. If
you
I'm
go to
co-commissioner, I'm giving up that title right now.
Okay, fine. You're nothing related to the LAFB league, but you're commissioner of your own respective league, right? So it's like
Unfortunately, yes,
usually
I am.
the goal of the commissioners, they work with everybody to figure out what is the best date for everybody to draft. Draft can either be done all online with the growing popularity of fantasy football. It's like you can play with people not just in your own area, but like across the country, across the world. So it's like that's the benefit of doing an online draft. Is just everybody logs on at this time and you draft your rosters and you're good to go. If you're local, I mean, I used to do this when I first started out and everybody was local and I played with everybody local. I did in-person drafts and it was fun. It's just like you got to sort of trash talk in person and I used to have a whiteboard. That was before the stickers and everything. That's when I was doing fantasy football. So I had a whiteboard and we were writing out names on a whiteboard and then we're logging. And then I, as commissioner, obviously went into the system later and I put all those names for everybody's rosters. And so that's the fun of an in-person draft. You could also like meet up at a bar. I know like Buffalo Wild Wings, a lot of these restaurants, they do like draft parties where it's like they provide you with like a draft board with all the stickers for all the players, and then you buy food and it's like discounted and all the stuff. So it's like you could do that. So you get drunk and do a live draft. Like, I mean, there's a lot of things you can be doing with the draft, but just, yeah, that's the next thing that you're waiting for. And Tad, I mean, also the fun thing, I know it doesn't really apply to you. We'll get to this in probably the next episode, but it's just like the fun thing about a fantasy draft is also selecting your draft order. And so, I mean, what are some of the fun ways? I'm sort of passing it to you here because I'm sort of doing a lot of talking now, but just what are some of the fun ways that you think you've encountered as far as people selecting the draft order?
Oh God, I mean, I'm gonna steal your thunder a bit here, and
yeah, exactly. That's why I passed it to you. I was like, you're actually just talking about me, but I'm not the one doing it now.
You're a bastard. So like Amir said, he is truly the commissioner. I am not co-commissioner. I don't know where the hell you got that from.
I think the first year you pitched it a little bit more than I took.
First year we really formed that.
Yeah.
So okay. So last year, the first year in the league, Amir said, "Okay, I'm going to figure out a fun way to, figure out how to do drafts." So we do a snake draft, and we'll touch on all of that later. But essentially, the draft order really matters. And this is why I'm not co-commissioner because people were texting me, "What is he going to do?" I'm like, I don't know. And he texted me. Maybe one of the weirdest texts I've ever got in my life is Amir texted me while I was at work, by the way. And goes, pick a marble. I was like, the hell are you talking about, man? And for those of you who don't know, on 8/8, August 8th, ESPN celebrates Dodgeball, the movie, by 24 hours of ESPN The Ocho, where they televise just these ridiculous sports. One of the, I guess you could call this a sport, marble racing.
Yes.
And so, so we had to pick a marble. And in case you're like, well, how do you pick a marble? You really don't. You really just, bet on someone and you're just like, God, I hope you win. And so that was last year. For those of you curious, he picked something even weirder for this year, which I believe as a recording, finals are in 3 days.
Yeah, August 10th. So, but like I said, I texted you when I was like figuring it out. I was like, it's more topical. It's not as random as last.
It's very topical. I will give you.
Your timing still a little random for sure.
The timing did work out well with this, but this also shows how creative you can get with it. Is we all had to pick a break dancing competitor was it now breaking?
The official name of the sport is called breaking, but yes, it is breakdancing, Olympic breakdancing, new to the Olympics this year.
Dumbest thing. And by the way, I just found out actually, it's not coming back. This is the only year it's going to be an Olympic sport.
Oh, really? Okay, that's news to me.
Yes,
that's news to me.
It will not be in LA in 28. So yeah, we all had to pick a breakdancer, and I Googled. I think I was second to last to pick.
Something along those lines.
So I was forced to pick like a 45-year-old breakdancer who, like, my best hope is they give him like the honorary like silver or something like that, because apparently this dude's gonna get his ass kicked. But yeah, no, like I never in my life thought I'd be doing research on breakdancing in my entire life. But yes, I was doing research. I was like, well, apparently this guy's pretty good. So now that is where the fun. We talked about, like, if you're a football fan. There are some obvious benefits to playing fantasy football, but even if you're a non-football fan, because, I have a friend of mine who he loves college football, but I shouldn't say hate, but he does not follow the NFL at all. And he has been trying to get in on this league for quite a while because it's just a great, like, friend bonding opportunity, talk some trash, spend some time together. I'm surprised. You were, you had to do the good old days with the board and go into the system.
Yeah.
I always want to ask you, how was the Great Depression, by the way? But even then, is what me and my friends, it was right there. I had to do it. But even what me and my friends do is we'll draft online, but we make sure there's a fair amount of us together drafting.
Yeah, so you do that too, yeah.
Yeah, and it's just because that experience together is so much fun. And yeah, the draft order is the first time to do that. And we'll talk about this in the next episode, but punishments as well. And I have several great stories about punishments. But yeah, it's just a great friend bonding experience. And also that excitement of football coming back is just upped by the excitement of fantasy football is also coming back. There's a reason why my friends were all bugging me, just yesterday, shortly after the Hall of Fame preseason game. Hall of Fame preseason game, first football game back in the summer. The hype is real. They want to be back. So, yeah, determining the draft order, tons of stuff you can find online. ESPN usually does an article about it every, August. But, yeah, you can get wild with it. Marbles and breakdancing.
Yeah, I should tell you my home league is based off skateboarding, so that the finals is tomorrow.
Well, at least it's been an Olympic sport for a while.
No, that's true. Actually, 2 years.
Really?
Yeah, only 2 Summer Olympics have had officially skateboarding. Yeah,
that's a good hypothetical. How many golds would Tony Hawk have won?
That's true. So, yeah, the whole point of a draft order is so it decides, when are you picking your players in a certain order. So, like I said, depending on 10 people, 12 people, however many it is, it's like you're placed in that sort of amount of area. So it's like, if you're picking a number 10, you're, the likelihood of you getting a better player than the person who's drafting team number 1 is maybe less likely. But that's where it sort of evens out.
And less likely?
Well, yeah. If strategies change, so people may make some weird changes, right? So it's like you never know, but it's just like, yeah, at initial glance, you'll probably get a less talented player compared to the person drafting at number 1. But that also affects as far as like the type of draft that you're in, because like Tad was mentioning here, snake draft. So what does that mean? Is like, let's say hypothetically you have 10 people in your league. What happens is that you go in the first round, you go from 1 to 10. And then in the second round, though, it's snakes. So, just like the classic game on your old Nokia brick phone, it goes from 10 to then 1. So it's like you go 1 to 10, you go 10 to 1, and it just continues that way until you draft your entire roster, typically around 16, 17 rounds or so that way. So that is a snake draft. Tad, you could explain an auction draft because you obviously play in an auction draft.
So an auction draft, which if you want my bet, I think they're probably going to change the name of that in a year or two.
Probably.
Yeah, probably. Is you get it's a lot like kind of like what you were explaining with daily fantasy, where you get a set money amount, and so the standard is usually $200. And rather than draft order doesn't matter as much with that because there is no technically draft order. The way it works is so I'll use my league as an example. So 10 people in my league. We randomize it. We just do whatever the computer decides. And whoever's up first, they get to select a player. However, you're not selecting them to be on your roster. So if you select, bid for Christian McCaffrey, let's say, or, who's a player most people know, Patrick Mahomes, who, by the way, is my mom's new favorite player, which is very weird. She was very upset about her Travis Kelce take, by the way. She texted me. I was like, oh, man, I did not know that was – I didn't even know you listened to the podcast. I was like, clearly you do. But point being is, so let's say I want Patrick Mahomes first. I would bid for him or I would put him up for nomination, and I would set a starting price. So I would start Patrick Mahomes at 15. Now, compared to a snake draft where if I was first overall and I wanted Mahomes first overall, you take Mahomes, he's on your team. What I'm doing is putting Mahomes out there for everyone to bid on. You're starting to see this has aged so well type thing. If you want a hilarious story, look up Odell Beckham Jr. ESPN auction draft. Ooh, man, I don't know if you remember that little controversy. But point being is, so each player in your league gets to then bid. And of course, as they bid, as with any auction, the price builds and builds and builds. And I know what you're thinking of, like, well, how does it just stop? How does no one pay $200 for Patrick Mahomes? Well, then you're screwed and you only have $1 to build out the rest of your roster. So eventually, just naturally, it caps itself out. But that's where the strategy comes in. So my strategy for auction drafts is usually I nominate a player I don't want, but it's still a big name, because that way you get other players to spend their money. So when a player that you do want comes in, you can bid more than them. So that's why we actually made the switch to auction draft. I don't recommend auction draft for beginners.
Yeah, I agree with that.
There's an incredible amount of strategy involved. It's very hectic. Like I said, I've been doing fantasy football for over a decade now. I still get flustered during auction drafts. You have got to make, because you only have, once you nominate a player to be bid on, it usually goes from 45 seconds to a minute is usually the standard, one of those two. And whoever has the highest bid by the time the timer's up, you're good. And an additional stressor on that is the timer will go down, but the second new bid comes up, timer resets to about 20 seconds. So now you got to rethink your strategy again. So, if you want, deeper analysis on how to do an auction draft, because again, there's a lot of strategy, and this is a whole other episode on top of it. That would be something we would consider. But essentially, that is what an auction draft is. And the thought process behind it is it levels the playing field of, yes, if you get first overall pick, that doesn't mean you automatically get the best team. Or, God forbid, if you're in a 10-man league and you get the dreaded number 5 spot in a snake draft, usually that's a kiss of death, because the snake draft doesn't affect you then, because you're in the number 5 spot no matter what. With auction drafts, it doesn't really matter. So, and plus it puts a real test to your football knowledge. So it's much more complicated. I think it's much more fun. But yeah, if you're going to do an auction draft, I would highly recommend you definitely dip your toes in some other leagues first, at least for the first year or so, and then try your hand at that, because it's intense. It's very intense.
Yeah, I'd highly recommend starting with snake first. I think that's an easier way to sort of get into it. Auction's a little bit more complicated. I agree with that. Another common setting, or not common, I guess, is at least less common, is auto. So it's like there's no drafting at all. So pretty much what you do is you set yourself.
God help you is basically the tagline of that.
Yeah. So pretty much what happens is that, let's say you're, want to set your lineups as far as like, I like this quarterback more than this quarterback. So you sort of set your rankings per position and then overall as well. And then what happens is you just let the computer decide, and it drafts everybody's rosters for them. And there's no deciding as far as like, who should I draft? It just does it for you automatically. This is also what happens default in case you do a live draft or just an online draft and somebody doesn't show up. The computer will draft for them and make them auto draft. So in case you can't show up, you can set it to auto draft, and they'll try and draft the best roster for you. But you get less selection in that. It's more just based on how you order things, which also takes a little bit of some strategy as well, and knowing a little bit more things than just doing it. So I wouldn't recommend that for beginners also. But one thing that's sort of growing in popularity here, Tad, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's called snake with a third round reversal. And so what the point of this is that you do
more slowly.
Snake with a third round reversal.
Oh, interesting.
So what happens here is you do a standard snake draft. So like I would put in the previous example, you go from 1 to 10, you go from 10 to 1 in the second round. But what happens is now when you get to the third round, it starts at 10 again. So you go 1 to 10, 10 to 1, but then it goes from 10 to 1 again for the third round. And then the rest of the draft is your standard snake draft. Now, why did this get introduced? A lot of people felt that if you kept it your standard snake draft, the person with the first couple of picks, either number 1 or number 2 overall, they tend to have a little bit more of a stacked roster compared to people that pick towards the end. And so that's why they introduced this, where it's like, okay, now you go through 2 rounds standard, but then now at that third round, this gives a chance to those people at the back and towards the middle a little bit too. They get a better chance to possibly select some better quality players, and it sort of evens out the playing field for the rest of the roster. Now, they've done statistics around it. It doesn't change it that much, but some people feel that it does make it, quote unquote, a little bit more fair. But that's really just up to your commissioner as far as how they want to run their typical snake draft, or whether they want to do it with a third round reversal. So, yeah, it's an interesting strategy.
Yeah, I had not heard of that. I'm just trying to process that. That is interesting. Well, and here's the big thing too, and I know we spent the past like 15 minutes talking about it, but here's the biggest piece of advice I can give for beginners on fantasy football. The season is not won on draft day. Agreed. Never once have I seen, well, that's not true. Very rarely have I seen the team that, quote unquote, drafts the best win the league. Because it's football. Crazy shit happens. People get hurt. Teams that should be good are terrible. It's wild. And I've also seen the saying that, the league is won on the waiver wire, and largely that could be true. But I've also seen teams that made great waiver wire pickups also choke it at the end. So, and that's another, and I know I keep going back to this talking point, but that's another beauty of fantasy football. Things you can turn around on a dime. Unfortunately, I was on the opposite end of one where I was one game away from making the playoffs. And I went into a movie. It was, oh God, what was it? Star Wars. What was the 7th episode called? Or not 7th. Yeah, 7th episode.
Force Awakens.
Force Awakens. Thank you. I walked into Force Awakens. I was up by 30 points. I was like, I got this. David Johnson, a running back for then the Arizona Cardinals, broke off a 50-point fantasy performance, which against the Philadelphia Eagles. I don't know if you remember that night.
I do.
It cost me a playoff spot, and I was one of the best teams all season. So that's another thing of like, if all this draft talk seems daunting, good, because you should take the draft seriously. Because if you draft poorly, I've seen teams that have drafted poorly being like, oh, he's going to finish last. And largely they finished last. But on the opposite side, even if another team is like, oh, damn, he kicked my ass in the draft, that does not guarantee you a league win at all. So that's the big thing is take the draft seriously. But at the same time, if you don't draft well, it's not the end of the road quite yet.
Yeah. And we'll cover all the draft stuff and what happens when you're actually in season in our next episode, because there's a lot to dive into there, how you prepare for your draft, things like common strategies and things along those lines. But we're going to stop it here as far as today's episode. But I mean, guys, if this has sort of gotten you a taste for fantasy football, then I mean, guys, join your respective fantasy football league on whatever platform that you want to play on. You just have to join on a respective platform. And there's a ton of open leagues, which we brought up during the episode. You just need to join one. You can get into all the fun and action. And if you need some help as far as just some advice on strategies and, how to build your roster and all that stuff, we'll cover that in the next episode. But that is what our podcast is for. We give you fantasy football advice. We're the, number one source on LAFB Network. But yeah, we definitely want to help you win some fantasy championships, especially if it's your first one. We definitely want to help you get the taste of fantasy football, become degenerates like myself and Tad. We want you to join the crowd. Follow us on Twitter. You see our ticker coming right down below. You got me at OverTheSide23, Tad Side94. Got the show handle at the Side Guys, and on Instagram at the Side Guys as well. We post all of our episodes on there. We post some polls on there. We post a lot of our advice on there. That's the best way you can interact with us. So if you have a question that we didn't cover in the episode, or just something that you're just not sure what to do, hit us up. We'll walk you through it. That's what we're here for. So guys, don't be afraid to interact with us. Subscribe to our podcast. We release your podcast. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're watching us on YouTube, we appreciate you. And please, guys, support our parent network at LAFB Network. They're giving you a lot of great content when it comes to the Rams and the Chargers at the professional level, and the Bruins and the Trojans when it comes to the college level, giving you lots of great content when it comes to all 4 LA football teams. Guys, if you listen to the podcast, if you're watching our videos, if you're interacting with us on social media, I mean, just anything and everything that you're doing to support the podcast, we really can't thank you enough.
And we hope this first episode, again, because we do have another episode coming out of 101, helped out you beginners. And guys, it's never too late to get involved in fantasy football. My dad's been interested in dipping his toe in, has been asking me questions about it. But also, if you want to keep coming back to us for advice, starting in just a couple weeks, we are going to start dropping weekly waiver wire episodes. If you're a beginner and you're like, I don't know who to target on the waiver wire, we got your back. We do it from week 1 to week, what is it now, 18, 19?
I think we go the full week. We go all the way to 18.
Unfortunately. And then we will also do, so that is, we usually record that on Monday. We usually record that during Monday Night Football, which is always very risky. And then later on in the week, we always do Stardom Sit-em, which is a term that you will get very familiar with. ESPN does an article, Sports Illustrated does an article. Most of them are AI written, so that's why you want to check out our episodes, because we actually do our research and look at what's called context. But yeah, if you're like, I don't know, do I start Rodgers or do I start, I almost said Flacco. Do I start Rodgers or do I start
Last year, that was a debate, kind of.
Well, not much, because Rodgers only lasted 4 snaps. But
just Flacco, possible option.
That's true. No, Flacco, Watson, yeah, oh man. But point being is, we got you on both, who do I start, who do I sit, and who do I pick up. And on top of everything else, if you're also a gambling man, we are doing YouTube shorts with our partners at Underdog Fantasy about the best bets you can place. That usually drops on, I want to say, Friday.
Usually on the weekend, so it's either Friday or Saturday.
Okay. Yeah. So Friday or Saturday. But bottom line is, we have a bunch of content coming your way in just a couple weeks, because believe it or not, we're just about a month out from kickoff. So be sure to tune in. And for those of you who are already tuned in and continue to do so, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. And please, as always, everyone, stay safe.